Listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the latest on high school diploma options and alternatives. I'm Bridget Aliaga, Brain Injury Training and Services Program Coordinator here at the Association. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. During this webinar, we will be holding 2 question and answer sessions. During the question and answer sessions, questions can be submitted via the question text box. The text box option should be visible to you on the GoToWebinar toolbar on your desktop. If you're having trouble viewing this option, please contact Citrix Tech Support at 800-263-6317. Again, that number is 800-263-6317. This number should also be visible to you on your toolbar. Our speaker will do her best to answer the questions in the order in which they are received. Any questions she is unable to address may be submitted via email to the association. We will be recording this webinar session and plan to post it along with presentation slides to our website, bianys.org. Information about contacting the association and viewing the webinar will be provided in a follow-up email after the presentation has ended. My contact information will also be included in those follow-up messages. Before I turn the microphone over to our presenter, let us begin with a quick poll to see who is in our audience today. Please take a moment to answer the question. All right, I'm launching the poll now. I'm going to give everyone about 10 to 15 seconds to answer that. Give another 5 seconds. All right, I'm going to close that poll and share the results. All right, so it looks like the majority of you are affiliated with a brain injury program or organization. The rest of you are either a healthcare professional or caseworker, a professional in a school setting, or other. So it looks like we have a fairly diverse group today, which is always great to see. And I just want to thank you all again for your participation in helping to spread the word about our monthly webinars. Your support is truly appreciated. So let me close this for you. It is with sincere pleasure that I introduce our presenter for today, Julie Michaels-Keegan. Julie recently joined Disability Rights New York as a staff attorney focused on individual cases and systematic issues impacting persons with developmental disabilities. For 10 years prior to joining DRNY, Julie practiced independently through the law office of Julie Michaels-Keegan, a law firm devoted exclusively to special education law and future care planning throughout upstate New York. Having negotiated the special education system for members of her own family, Julie is committed to the educational rights and long life needs of people with disabilities. Julie has provided hundreds of trainings on a wide variety of special education issues for parents, advocates, service providers, attorneys, and school personnel. Good afternoon, Julie. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Bridget. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity. For the audience, I have to tell you this is the first time I've done a webinar, so it's really odd for me to be speaking into a phone as opposed to looking at a sea of faces, but I'm just going to assume that everyone out there is smiling back at me at this moment. I think this is a very important topic, and it's certainly one that has been changing very drastically over the last 5 or 6 years. The types of diplomas that are available to students with disabilities and other options or alternatives to diplomas has been a hot topic at the Board of Regents and New York State Education Department. And a lot of that has come from parents and advocates and students who are frustrated with a high-stakes setting, a high-stakes setting for achieving a diploma. So State Ed and the Board of Regents, I think, have really made a sincere effort to try to address a lot of the concerns that parents and students and schools have had. But it's, as we'll discuss today, there's some really good things that have come out of the discussions over the last 6 years, but there's also some issues and problems, and I am going to make you aware of those. Those are from my perspective. But I think it's important that you know what to look for and what may be a pitfall, so that you can serve as an advocate for a student and make sure that they are on track to get the best possible outcome from school that they can. So my plan for today is to talk initially about what I call bona fide diplomas. And by bona fide diploma, I'm talking about a diploma that will meet the requirement if a college or a community college or a university says high school diploma. Will meet the requirement for the military if they say we require a high school diploma. Will meet the requirements of an employer who might post a job and say we need a high school diploma. So so when I talk about bona fide diplomas, I'm talking about the types of diplomas that will open those doors and meet those requirements. So that's what we're first going to talk about. And we're going to talk about the diploma options that are available to all students, and then the options that are available, the additional options that are available to students with disabilities. After we discuss all of those, and we're also going to talk about the new test assessing secondary completion, which is the replacement for the GED. After we talk about all of those types of bona fide diploma options, I'm going to offer an opportunity for questions because some of this information is kind of complex. I've worked really hard and have done this presentation several times and have really tried to refine it each time to deliver this information so it's not so confusing. I've also provided you with a handout from State Ed that lists all the different types of diploma and credential options and the requirements. So I'm hoping that between all this information it will be clear, but I just want to give folks that opportunity to ask questions at that time. And then we're going to start talking about the new credentials. So we no longer have an IEP diploma. We're going to talk a little bit about that and why we don't have it anymore. And then the two different credentials that are out there that were intended or are intended to replace the IEP diploma, and kind of go through what some of those requirements are. All of this stuff is pretty brand new, all within the last year. So hopefully you'll find this information helpful. And then when that's done, Bridget's going to do some Biani's announcements, and then I'll take questions again and you can ask me anything about the first or second part of this, this webinar. All right, so if we're going to talk first about the bona fide diplomas. Those are the ones that are going to open the door to college and military and employers who are looking for a high school diploma. So in New York State, we are a Regents Diploma state. There are only 2 states in the country that are Regents Diploma, and New York is one of them. Regents Diploma is available to all students. If you are a student without a disability, meaning you're a student who does not have a 504 plan or a student who does not have an IEP, an individualized education program, then the only way for you to get a bona fide diploma in New York State is through the a Regents Diploma. In order to obtain a Regents Diploma in New York State, we need to have 22 high school credits, and there's specific subjects that we need those credits in. So it's seat time in specific classes and some electives that go along with that. In addition, and probably the biggest stumbling block for students with disabilities, is that a student has to take at least 5 Regents exams. Those Regents exams are in 5 subjects. So we have a math Regents, which is usually taken at the end of 9th grade, but it doesn't have to be. It can be taken at any time. We have an English Regents, which is usually taken at the end of the junior year, but again, that can be taken at any time. We have a science requirement, so 1 science, and usually most high schools will offer a variety of Regents science, like Regents level science courses. So you might be taking biology, I think it's called living environment now, or taking something else, chemistry or something else that will meet that science requirement. And then for social studies, you must take American history, which is usually taken in 11th grade, and global history, which I'm saving for last because that's typically a huge stumbling block for students with disabilities and students without disabilities. Global studies is a 2-year course, so the Regents doesn't come till the end of that 2 years. So you can imagine that that is very difficult because there's, first of all, a tremendous amount of information that's shared over the 2 years, and then that test is testing stuff that you learned almost 2 years ago. So for kids with learning disabilities, kids with TBI, where memory and long-term memory, things like that are an issue, global can be very difficult. I do know the Board of Regents is very cognizant of the global problem that is, you know, kids are really stumbling on this. So they are currently exploring other ways of administering the global studies piece, but I don't think global studies is going to be going away anytime soon. So in order to get this Regents Diploma, we have to have those 22 credits, and we have to have a score of 65 or better on each of those 5 required exams. You can have a 95 on 4 of those exams and a 60 on the remainder, and you will not be eligible for a Regents Diploma. You are allowed to take Regents Diplomas repeatedly, so you can take it more than once. A lot of students do this. They might get extra help over the summer, or they might be taking a refresher course that allows them to take the course repeatedly until they pass it. But it is a requirement, and there's no exception to it if you're a student without a disability. So basically, that's the Regents Diploma. Now, for students with disabilities, we also have the option of something called a local diploma, which is a bona fide diploma. It will be accepted by colleges, it will be accepted by employers, it will be accepted by the military, vocational schools, things like that. The local diploma, I'm going to date myself, you can't see me, but when I went to high school in New York, there were 2 ways of getting a diploma. There was the Regents Diploma or something called the high school diploma. And when I went to school, kids who were thinking about going to college were headed towards a Regents Diploma, and kids who wanted to work as soon as they got out of school, which was not uncommon at that time, would be taking the high school diploma. And that was available to all students. You didn't have to have a disability. That is not how things are in New York State now. In New York State, if you can obtain a local diploma only if you are a student with a disability. This year, at this moment, there are 3 ways that a student with a disability can obtain a local diploma. And those are the only 3 ways. You'll see why, but in a year or 2, one of those ways isn't going to be available anymore either, and we'll just be left with the 2. But I'm going to go through those 3 ways with you right now. So the first is the low pass option. The low pass basically says, look, take the 5 Regents exams, and as long as you score a 55 or better on those exams, we will give you a local diploma. So in the scenario I gave you before, if I got a 95 on all 4 exams and then I got a 60 on the last exam, I would still be eligible for the local diploma because I've gotten higher than a 55 on all 5 of those exams. Even if I score 55 on all of those exams, I will get a local diploma. So that low pass option has been around for a while, and I think it's here to stay. I don't think we're going to see any changes with that. The second option is the Regents Competency Test, or RCT option, and that's the one that's phasing out. Students who entered 9th grade after the 2011-2012 school year. So students who entered 9th grade in the 2012-2013 school year, last year, would not be eligible, nor would any class entering 9th grade after them. So you had to have entered 9th grade prior to the 2011-12 school year in order to be eligible for the RCT option. What is that? RCTs, Regents Competency Tests, are basically kind of condensed and reduced versions of each Regents exam. So the math RCT absolutely tests math concepts, but it might not have the same scope as the Regents exam. So it would be honed down just to the bare bones essential knowledge that a student would need to have. And so there's an RCT available in all the required subjects for Regents. And while it sounds like a good thing, I mean, and I think the Regents competency tests have helped certain students, the way that it was administered was sometimes problematic because the people who were developing the Regents exam were different than the people who were developing the RCT. So there's different language that's used in those two exams. When a student is in high school and they're taking Regents level classes, the language that is used to provide instruction is geared towards the Regents exam. The test language is geared towards the test language of the Regents exam. So the RCT is written a little bit differently, and it may be asking the same question but in a different way. And for some kids, particularly students with disabilities, just being asked in a different way can throw that student off. So as much as this is helpful in a way because it reduces the amount of knowledge you need, it also, I don't think it was as successful as it could have been because they weren't teaching to the language of that particular test. But regardless, RCT is going to be phased out. Again, you had to have entered 9th grade prior to the 2011 school year. All right, and then the third option for a local diploma, and this is the newest option. It was new in October 2012. It's called the compensatory option. And there is a handout. In fact, one of the resources that I gave you is a list of resources where there is a lot more information on each of these different options. And the resource on the questions and answers on compensatory safety net option is very, very helpful. It gives great examples. And if this is something that might apply to your student, I would definitely encourage you to have a look at that. But basically what the compensatory option is it allows you to get as low as a 45 on a Regents exam as long as you have a score of 65 or better on another Regents exam. So if I get a 45 in global, but I've gotten a 65 in English, one compensates for the other. The English compensates for the global, and therefore I'll be okay. Couple caveats here. First, you have to have at least a 55 in English and math no matter what. So you can't get that 45 even if you have a compensating score of 65 or more in another subject because the state has said you have to have at least a 55 in the English and math Regents. But other than that, it can be pretty helpful. So if you have, like I said, a 45 on global, but you got a 65 on English, you would be okay. Now, if you got a 45 on global and a 45 in science, you would have to have 2 scores over 65 in order, so for each score as low as 45, between 45 and 54, for each one of those scores, you have to have a score of at least 65 or better. So I know that that's kind of confusing, and it's hard when I can't look at you and know that you're either looking at me with 5 heads or this is making sense to you. But there's definitely an opportunity to ask questions about that. And again, that resource can be very helpful. It gives a lot of examples of what a scenario might look like. But the key is at least a 55 on English and math, and then for every score below on the other 3 exams, science, global, and American, if you get below a 55, you have to have at least a 65 in something else. And the other thing I wanted to tell you is that you also, if it is a student who has been taking RCTs their RCTs, you can't combine it with this. So if you're on an RCT track for a local diploma, then that's all you can use. If you want to use the compensatory track, then that's all you can use. One thing that's really important to know about the local diploma option is that, or the compensatory option, is that this is available to students who have graduated if they're under 21. And what do I mean by that? Since this came out in October 2012, there were students who may have taken the Regents exams, and had this option been available, they would have been eligible for a local diploma. So maybe they had a 45, but they had a 65 in something else. If you recall, the only other way before was if you had a 55 or better in everything. So if that applies to a student that you know, they need to go back to school, and they actually have to re-enroll in school, but they're re-enrolling simply for the purpose of the school to look at those Regents exams and award a diploma. I mean, obviously you have to meet all their credit requirements, but if you have met those credit requirements, you can re-enroll in school and they can award that diploma. And that would only be for students with disabilities, and it has to be prior to the student, would have to be completed prior to the year in which the student turns 21. So I said that wrong, sorry. A student with a disability is entitled to be in school and receive special education services through the year in which they turn 21. The only thing that stops the obligation on the school district is the award of a Regents diploma or a local diploma. Otherwise, the school must continue to provide services if the student is enrolled. So in this case, maybe the student left school at 19 but had the right scores that if they went back, they would be able to use the compensatory option. They would re-enroll and be awarded that diploma. So if that's a situation that applies to you, the best thing to do is to contact the school district in writing and discuss that option with them. All right, and now the new, I'm going to just need a sip of water here. Many of you might be familiar with the GED. GED is a national test that is a test of knowledge of at the secondary level, at the high school level. A lot of people have taken the GED. The GED is typically perceived as a bona fide diploma. If you have a GED, it will meet the requirements of an employer. It will meet the requirements of the military. Some community colleges or some colleges may not give a GED as much weight or value as they might give a Regents diploma, but if they require a high school diploma, it's going to meet that criteria. So we had the GED in New York State for a very long time, and the state would always make sure that the test was provided for free and even provide training, instruction for people to pass the GED. And that's always been provided for free, and there's a long history that supports that. However, a few years ago, the corporation that owns GED said, you know what, we're changing it. We're going to make it a computer-based format. We're going to change the questions that we're asking, and we're going to charge you, New York State, a whole lot more than what we've charged you in the past. So the state responded to that by saying, well, I'm not sure we have to stick with the GED. Maybe we should look at some alternative options. And they initially started talking to some of our neighboring states to see if they wanted to develop a regional test that would be the equivalent of a GED. They decided not to do that. They were exploring developing their own test, but then a I think it's McGraw-Hill, has come along with a GED replacement, and it's called the Test Assessing Secondary Completion, which I'm going to refer to as the TASC, T-A-S-C. The TASC went into effect on January 1st of this year. So there is no more GED. We only have the TASC available to us. The test is very similar to what the GED had been proposing, but I have to imagine that the price is much better because New York has adopted the TASC. New York will continue to provide this test for free to eligible students and eligible adults, so that means people who maybe have dropped out of school or have not been able to secure a diploma can pursue the TASC. There are requirements, and they haven't been finalized yet, but as with the GED, depending on your age, there are additional requirements to just passing the test. So for younger students, 16, sometimes 17 years old, there are like half-day instruction requirements or a certain number of hours of instruction that are required in addition to any preparation for this test. As you get older, those requirements are reduced. I would encourage you to look at the website. I did provide the link on that resource list that talks all about the requirements and eligibility for the TASC. The TASC is very similar to the GED in that it covers 5 subject areas. Those are English language arts, math, science, history, and writing. To take the whole thing, it's 5 to 7 hours. There are paper-based formats and computer-based formats. Right now, we don't have all the computers needed to make it a completely computer-based test, but that will be coming as the test centers start converting to using computers. GED was always a paper and pencil test. I think this is good in some ways. I think there are students who may respond better to a computer-based test. On the other hand, there may be students who this would be a nightmare for. And fortunately, well, and also according to our laws, the test still needs to be made available in whatever format is needed to accommodate a student with disabilities. So if a student with disabilities needs it to be in a paper format, it must be provided in that paper format. Likewise, students with disabilities are entitled to whatever testing accommodations are needed in order for them to be successful on that test. Accommodations usually are found, you have to apply for them in advance, and usually like 2 or 3 months in advance. People need to know that. You can't walk into the test center on the day of the test and say, oh, I need someone to, I need a scribe, I need someone to write this for me, or I need someone to read this to me. You have to apply for accommodations in advance, well in advance, and those accommodations have to be approved. Very important to know that if you're advocating for someone and accommodations, the first and primary thing they're going to look at is the student's IEP, or Individualized Education Program, or their 504 plan, and to look at what accommodations have been provided in the past. Because typically, that's an indication that the student, that there's been consensus that the student really needs these accommodations. If there isn't evidence that the student has been receiving those accommodations in the past while they've been in school, it's going to be a much more difficult road to try to get accommodations. The testing board may require a psychological evaluation. The school's most recent triennial evaluation may suffice, or they may say they need additional evidence and look to a psychological evaluation. Again, if you look at the TASC website, there's a lot of information on accommodations and the process that you go through and what types of accommodations are available and how to go about securing them. Another thing to know about this, and this was recently decided, is you do not need to, this is true of the GED too. You do not need to pass every section in one sitting of the test. So I might take that test 6 different times and pass one subject at a time. And that's permissible. As long as you pass it once, it goes on your record that that subject area has been passed. When you take it again, you will have to take that subject area, but if you fail it the second time, that doesn't matter as long as you passed it the first time. So it's cumulative. Board of Regents recently decided that if you took the GED and you've passed one subject or 4 subjects or however many subjects, they will allow those subject scores to be carried over to the task. So for example, if I've passed everything but English on the GED, those scores where I've passed the writing, the math, the science, and the history will all come over. And that when I take the task, I will only need to be passing the English. So that's a good thing because otherwise people were kind of left in a lurch. Last fall, people were scurrying to take the GED because they didn't feel like it was going to be around anymore, but they have allowed this grandfathering in of the prior GED scores. The other thing to know is that in addition to achieving a certain score on each one of those subject matter tests, you also have to have a cumulative score to pass the whole task. So for example, and I don't know what the required points are for each section of those tests, but let's say, for example, you needed to get 100 points to pass each section. And so I might have 100 points in each one of those 5 subject areas, but there's something like I would need 120 points, or excuse me, I would need 520 points in order to get the whole, to be considered passing the task. So it's not just the bare minimum on each subject matter. It's actually, you need a cumulative total of points that's in excess of the bare minimum across settings. It's not a whole lot more, but it's a little bit more. And again, that information is spelled out in more detail on that resource I provided. What else to know about this test? Just from my own perspective, having advocated for students with disabilities for many, many years now, I think sometimes the task, the GED, are very good options for students who have a difficult time in a traditional high school setting or in a traditional high school class. This is much more flexible. It allows a student to really focus on one subject at a time, pass that test, get it under their belt, and move into something else. So for students who do struggle in the traditional setting, this can be very helpful. Many high schools can support a student taking a test like this by providing supplemental instruction to help them pass that test. That's something that would have to be decided by the Committee on Special Ed, but it's definitely an option that's out there, and so one you should keep in mind. The other thing is that the task has announced, McGraw-Hill has announced that they are going to be aligning the task to the Common Core. So about 3 years from now, the test will be aligned to the Common Core standards. The Common Core for regions has gotten pushed out now to 2022, I think, and what that means is originally all of the students graduating from New York State with a Regents Diploma would be taking Common Core Regents by 2017. And recently the Board of Regents said, you know, that's not what we're going to do. So the first class of graduating students will have to take a Common Core Regents in each subject is the class of 2022. So they've pushed it out further. So I think they might do this on the task too. but I don't know that for sure. But they may be stretching out the Common Core based task to be a little bit longer instead of just 3 years from now. It will be harder because it's just different if they're using Common Core standards. So hopefully that's the information that you need. I hope it was fairly clear, but I am going to take questions now. If anybody has any questions about the bona fide diplomas we've talked about, the Regents diploma, the local diploma options, and the task, I'd be happy to answer those questions now.
Okay, it looks like we have one general question about the Regents. Let's see, it says, are there accommodations for Regents when a child with a TBI is not fully recovered enough to perform on the level they were formally able to? So I guess, is there an option to take a Regents at a different time, or?
Yes, there is no prescribed time when you take a Regents. Like I said, typically you will take certain Regents at the end of certain years, but it is not mandated that that happen, and you can also take a Regents repeatedly. I think it would take some careful planning with the school guidance office and the Committee on Special Ed to think about maybe front-loading the student's education with more electives and then moving towards the Regents classes when there's more stability in the learning style or learning ability of the student, if there's a recovery, if recovery is an issue at that time. But I think it would take some careful planning, because you also want to allow enough time that if the student has to take it again and again, that they can. And also the Regents classes tend to be more difficult than elective classes, so taking 3 or 4 or more of them at one time could also be problematic. So I think it would take some discussion with the team.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And it looks like we don't have any more questions unless somebody wants to ask a question before we want to move on to the next section. So I'll give people maybe 5-10 seconds to get those in. I think you were pretty clear on that, Julie. That's why no one's asking any questions.
Oh, I hope so. I think the stuff is kind of confusing, but I think those resources are helpful too.
No, I think you did a really good job of just laying that out very clear and straightforward. It was very easy to understand. So if we're all ready, I think we're good to move on to the next section. I don't see any more questions.
All right. All right, so now we're going to move into the non-diploma options. So these are credentials that are now available that they're brand new. And in many ways, they were intended to replace the IEP diploma. And I am going to give you a little history, because I think if you can understand the history and the concerns about the IEP diploma, then you will have a much better understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the new proposed credentials. But the first thing you need to know is that these credentials are not bona fide diplomas. So if an employer says you must have a high school diploma to get an interview here or have this position, a credential is not going to meet that requirement. And that would also go for school, for colleges, military, and so forth. So these are alternative credentials. So the first thing, just a little history on the IEP diploma. 2008, there was a lot of complaining, and there had been prior to that too, but in 2008, Board of Regents and New York State Education Department began validating the concerns about the IEP diploma and started mulling over different ways to address the IEP diploma issues. Some of the issues that have been identified by advocates and parents and schools and so forth, I'm going to just go through that list, because again, you got to keep these issues in mind when we start looking at the new credentials. The first was that the IEP diploma was extremely arbitrary. So what an IEP diploma meant was this student has achieved the goals on their IEP. And that's the only qualification that IEP diploma conveyed, was that the student had achieved the goals on their IEP. Now, we all know that goals on IEP are supposed to be individualized to each student. So if I'm an employer and I have student A and student B and student C, and they each have an IEP diploma, I know nothing about any of the three of them because all of their goals are different. So I don't know what student A achieved or student B achieved or student C achieved, and unless I gave the employer my IEP, which I would not want to do, it really would not tell that employer or college or anyone else anything about me, except that I'm a student with a disability and I have an IEP. So there was no tying that credential of the IEP diploma to any standards. There was no test. There was no certain skill set that you needed. It was very arbitrary, so it became very meaningless. The second was it wasn't, and for that reason, it wasn't widely accepted by employers, the military, colleges, or trade schools. There was a time when community colleges would accept students with IEP diplomas, but insist that they take some vocational some remedial classes, not for credit. You'd have to pay for them, but not for credit, to beef up their skills so that they could enter a credit degree earning track. And that still is available, but it's not, it wasn't opening the doors that people might have anticipated that it would open because of the word diploma. Another problem was that it was really overused. When the IEP diploma came out, it was intended to be for those students with disabilities who were the most severely impacted by their disability. So maybe they were looking at a max of 8% of all students with disabilities, and I mean an absolute max of 8% of students with disabilities. And what was happening was it was being given to 20% and sometimes even higher percentages of students with disabilities, simply because those students were not able to get a local diploma, they weren't able to get a Regents diploma, and so the IEP diploma became the only option. So it was getting awarded to everybody, but having really no impact or any meaning for those students. Some people felt that that an IEP diploma track lowered the expectations for students, so that if it was decided at some level that this student is never going to get a Regents or a local diploma, then they would be kind of designated into a life skills track at school, and there would kind of be a give up on the academics attitude. And that's certainly not fair, because there are many students who, with the right supports, are able to pass these tests and move in that direction, but without those supports, they're not going to be there, and then they're kind of tracked. So tracking was a big issue. It was also the use of the term diploma in IEP diploma was very misleading. So if you were a student, or excuse me, a parent in a CSE meeting, and you were told that your child was going to be receiving an IEP diploma, you may have very well perceived that to be a bona fide diploma. I mean, it is the word diploma, and unless someone would take the time to explain that the IEP diploma had limitations, there might be, there was kind of a shock at the end of high school when the student went out to try to use this IEP diploma and it wasn't getting them anywhere. I think around 2010, the schools were mandated by state ed to share with parents the implications, the negative implications of an IEP diploma. But all of that sort of doesn't matter, because as of last June, there is no more IEP diploma. So the last IEP diploma was awarded last June, and we will never see an IEP diploma again. I anticipate we won't. Obviously, too, last thing is that having an IEP diploma identifies the person as having a disability. So if you are sharing that information with an employer, you are automatically disclosing that you have a disability. So as you can see, there's a lot of problems with the IEP diploma. So a lot of people across settings, advocates, students, parents, even school officials were saying we need something better for kids. I happen to be part of the New York State Special Ed Task Force. We had many meetings about this, providing public comment to State Ed and the Board of Regents on how not only let's get rid of the IEP diploma, but what can we put in its place. And there was pretty consistent feeling that we needed to have a credential that wasn't so high-stakes testing-based, because there are many, many students who may not have the ability to perform well on a high-stakes test, but are certainly able to be very successful at an entry-level job and then progress from there. So definitely students with skills that would allow them to perform very well in a job, but just unable to pass these tests. So there was a lot of feedback from advocacy groups saying we need to come up with something that isn't so test-based. Let's look at something that's more skills-based. And State Ed certainly took that to heart. There are other states that offer more skills-based options, but State Ed did come up with 2 skills-based credentials, and I'm going to talk to you about the difference between those 2. And there's pros and cons that go with each one of those. So let's move into those now. So this came into being this year. So this fall, or this spring in June, this is the first year that we will be seeing these types of credentials being awarded to students leaving high school, students with disabilities. These credentials are only available to students with disabilities, and I will talk about that issue in a little bit. But so the first is, option 1 is a skills, it's called the Skills and Achievement Commencement Credential. And this is probably the closest, I think this was really intended to address those students who the original IEP diploma was intended for. So the Skills and Achievement Commencement Credential is only available to students who are severely severely impacted by their disability. And therefore, only students who are being taught the alternate learning standards and being measured by alternate learning standards are going to be eligible for the Skills and Achievement Commencement Credential. What do I mean by alternate learning standards? In New York State, we've always had learning standards. Those learning standards, for every subject, they apply to all students except for a very small percentage, like 1 to 2% of students with disabilities. It may be as high as 4%. I'm never sure. It's somewhere between 1 and 4%, except for students who are so severely impacted by their disability that it's very evident that there is no way they're ever going to be able to achieve the learning standards that apply to all other students in New York State. So right now, our New York State learning standards are the Common Core standards. But last year, there were New York State learning standards that were not Common Core, but they were standards. Now we have Common Core standards. But we had alternate learning standards. So if you go on the New York State website and search alternate learning standards, there are a list of standards. It's not just some phrase. I mean, there are actual standards. So if you are someone who's alternately assessed, you are going to have certain standards that apply to you. But again, that is there's only those students with severe impact by their disability, and that determination is made by the Committee on Special Ed. So we have that group. The second credential applies to any other student with a disability. That's called the New York State Career Development and Occupational Studies Commencement Credential, which is like the longest thing you could ever want to say. I'm going to refer to it as the CDOSC, but that's the other credential that's available to any student with a disability who is not alternately assessed. All right, so let me go into a little bit more detail about each one of those. The Skills and Achievement Commencement Credential, which has the unfortunate acronym of SACC, went into effect July 1st and is awarded to students who are alternately assessed. They also have to have had at least 12 years of education. And just a reminder, I know I said this before in another context, but a student with a disability under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, must be provided an education and special education services through the school year in which they turn 21 unless they get a Regents or a local diploma. So the SACC would probably be awarded probably when the student is 21 unless they've left school earlier. But they have to have at least 12 years of education. Now, the SACC is a vast improvement over the IEP Diploma. Because if you remember, the IEP Diploma was very arbitrary. It just meant you passed you met your IEP goals. The SACC actually has a form that lists a whole variety of different kinds of skills, functional academic skills, social skills, behavioral, management, things like that, much more informative about where this student is in terms of their proficiency in functional skills and so forth. And this is much more useful because typically kids who are going to be getting the SACC are the ones that will be in some kind of supported environment when they leave high school. So they might be in a day hab program or a supported employment program or participating in some kind of group programming during the day. It wasn't always easy to figure out what student belonged where because there was very little information about that particular student's skill level. Students who are able to be more independent and with stronger functional skills probably have the opportunity to do a lot more, participate in programs that are much more community-based, doing volunteer work, getting out, things like that, whereas someone who maybe has much less skills in that area may be in a more community, or excuse me, a center-based type programming after they leave school. So having this information about where the student is at skill-wise is very helpful to those adult programs in meeting and tailoring the needs of those programs to these students. So there is a form that's out there. It's that's a summary of the student's academic achievement and their functional performance, and it has to have some recommendations on how to help that student continue to meet their goals moving forward. There is an assessment of achievement and independence, and when they're looking at those skills, they're also looking at some pre-employment skills, occupational type of skills, job-related competencies or understanding. Again, just to look at where the student might be at and what they might be able to do when they leave school. So I think most people would agree that the SACC is a huge improvement over the IEP Diploma. But it is a credential. It is not a bona fide diploma. But for students, for this segment of students that it's targeted for, which again is those kids most profoundly impacted by their disability, it can be very useful. The second credential, which we're going to go into in a little bit more depth, is the CDOSC, the New York State Career Development and Occupational Studies Commencement Credential. That must be the longest named diploma I have ever seen, but again, I'm just going to refer to it as the CDOSC. This again is a credential that's only available to students with disabilities. And that was a big debate early on because originally it was proposed as something that would be available to all students. And there's a lot of reason why we would want it available to all students, because by making it only available to students with disabilities, there's a recognition, you know, if you're handing this credential, you're obviously disclosing that you have a disability. And so, you know, there were a lot of people that felt it should be available to all students. You know, there's debate on both sides, but I just wanted to point that out to you. It is a Regents endorsed credential, which I think does give it some weight. Not everybody who is a student with a disability is going to be able to achieve this credential. In fact, I think once I go through the requirements with you, you'll see that I think a lot of students with disabilities are not going to achieve the credential unless they really compromise on the requirements of their credential. But it does really emphasize skill-based achievement. So instead of there being high-stakes testing, it's an assessment of skills. Does this student have the career and occupational skills to move on to employment? The goal is for a student to be able to take this certificate, and hopefully it will open the door to an employer. It's geared towards employment after you're leaving high school. So one thing I want to tell you too is that if you are a student with a disability and you're getting a Regents diploma or a local diploma, you can still get the CDOSC, you can still get this credential. But if you don't get a Regents diploma or a local diploma, the CDOSC is also available. So no matter what, if you're a student with a disability, you can get the CDOSC. But if you get a local or Regents diploma on top of it, that's great. Okay, so it's not a regular high school diploma. It's a credential that's geared towards promoting employment of students with disabilities. So there are minimum requirements related to the CDOSC, and again, there's a very good, much more in-depth discussion of those requirements in the resource materials that I gave you. There's a link to a state ed website that really discusses this in detail, but I'm just going to go through some of these requirements. The first is that the student has to develop a career plan, and the student is really the one who's developing the career plan. Of course, they can receive support and get support of school professionals to help them in developing their career plan, but it's really supposed to be developed by the student, which, you know, makes sense because it's the student's career and they need to kind of take ownership of that document. So it has to include a discussion of the student's interests and goals in terms of career, what strengths or weaknesses that student feels that they have in relation to meeting the goals for their career, has to talk about what courses and experience the student has that will help them move towards a career, and that could include outside activities, summer activities, employment, things like that. The career plan has to be reviewed and revised annually. There is a model form that state ed has put out, but that form is not required. I would imagine that most schools are using the form because I don't think there's anything else out there, and if you use the form, you know you're meeting all these requirements. It's intended that this career plan, I mean, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the IEP development process, and if you have a student who's 15 years or older, you would know that at age 15 we start talking about transition in the IEP, and that's a requirement under the federal law that we start looking at what's this student's goals for when they leave school, what skills do they need to develop to be successful in meeting those goals when they leave school, and then using the IEP to identify what additional supports and services that child needs in order to transition into adulthood and their post-secondary goals. So if the student is really focused on moving into work when they leave school, then we need to make sure that student has those school work-based skills. The student is focused on going to college after they leave school, then the focus is going to be a little bit more on academics. If you have a student who maybe has compromised social skills, we know that those are important for college and employment, and so we might need to be working on those too. So it's really looking at the individual needs of the student. So this career plan is something that I would recommend. I would recommend the students start developing when there's the CSE starts talking about transition, which is when the student turns 15. And then it would be revised annually, and it may change drastically. I mean, I have kids, and one day they want to be a pilot, and the next day they want to be this and that, and you know, our interests change. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there's this requirement that we're looking at the students' goals, their needs, and what they've been able to achieve thus far to move them forward. So that's the career plan requirement. The second requirement, and this is the one that I think is going to be the one that is probably the biggest obstacle to achieving the CDOSC, and that is evidence that the student has achieved the Career Development and Occupational Studies Learning Standards. So that's a mouthful. So let me just say this. I told you that there's learning standards for all subjects, English, math, writing, all of those things, science, and then there's alternate learning standards for students with severe disabilities. And then there are career development and occupational learning standards. So kids who are participating in vocational programs at BOCES in high school, you know, would be looking at these learning standards, kids who are on a vocational track. So these learning standards have always been out there, but in developing this new credential, State Ed said, well, we already have these learning standards. So if a kid is going to be getting this CDOSC credential, then that kid should be meeting these learning standards. But those learning standards are measured at an elementary level, an intermediate level, and a commencement level. So a basic, a medium, and a proficient level, okay? And for this credential, the student has to meet each of these learning standards at the commencement level. That means the highest level. So they have to be proficient in all of the areas, in all of the learning standards under the Career Development and Occupational Studies Learning Standards. I think that's a tall order. There is no test for figuring out if a student there's three areas that the CDOSC learning standards cover. Those are career development, integrated learning, and universal foundation skills. And then within each one of those three areas, there's specific learning standards. And we have to be proficient in all of them. There's no test that's out there that will tell me if the student is proficient in on a particular learning standard. What is out there are a list of examples of activities that the student would be able to do if they were proficient in that particular area. And even those examples vary widely. So for example, I can't remember which learning standard it was. I think it was like management of resources or something like that. And one example of the proficient or the commencement level was the student is able to plan a school-based business, project the amount of inventory they would need for the next 3 months, project the revenue, expenses, you know, pretty complex kind of business task there. And that was one example of being proficient. in the same set of examples was a student, the students in a room by themselves, and they are told, you need to teach a hypothetical staff how to build a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So you got to sit here and write down the steps that you would need to create a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for someone who has no idea what a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is or what it's supposed to look like. So you develop that plan, then you actually take it into a classroom and instruct people on how to build a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That is also an example of being proficient in these on that standard. So I think there's a pretty big difference there in those types of examples. I hope you're seeing that too. And while it's good that there's some flexibility in measuring proficiency, and it's good that we don't have a high-stakes test, since there is no kind of set measure of proficiency, School A may rate a student proficient, and School B may not, even for a student who has exactly the same skills. So then we start heading back into that territory of it being a little bit arbitrary, right? Because if there isn't a well-spelled out, here's what you need to be able to do to be proficient in this particular skill, it's going to be subjective. You know, teacher here is going to say yes, teacher there is going to say no, and then we start getting all kinds of mixed messages. Those students, the student where they said yes, they're proficient, goes out and hands their credential to an employer, and the employer says, oh, you're proficient in this, and then the student starts to work and they are not proficient, but someone thought they were. That's going to also undermine the credibility of that credential. And obviously, if the purpose of this credential is to open the doors of open employers' doors, then having students with a whole variety of skill levels is not really going to help that, because the employer's not going to be able to count on a student having this credential translating into the student can handle this job, because it's still a little arbitrary. So that's a bit of an issue, you know, and hopefully the state ed is going to start developing some more specific guidelines, not a test, but some guidelines as to this is what the student needs to do in order to demonstrate that they have mastered this particular standard. The learning standards, I gave you the website for the learning standards, and that happens to be on the PowerPoint handout that's on your screen right now. And just keep in mind that schools are required to provide instruction to help students master these standards. So that's a very important question to be asking at the CSE. You know, if your student is pursuing this credential, you would want to be asking what classes are helping my student become, you know, proficient or at the commencement level of these particular learning standards. All right, the third requirement to get a CDOSC is that you have to have coursework and work-based experience. So there has to be at least 2 units of study, and in New York State, 1 unit of study is 108 hours. Typically, a unit of study is like a year of math, a year of social studies. That's the equivalent of 1 year. So we have to have equivalent of 2 years of career-related courses and or work-based learning experiences. And of that total 216 hours, there has to be at least 54 hours of it has to be based on work-based learning experience or the completion of a national certification of work readiness. I am not familiar with national certifications of work readiness, but I do know they're out there, and I've heard, without exploring, I've heard that there's actually some pretty good stuff out there, but I'm not in a position to talk to you about that today. But the other option is the 54 hours of work-based learning. So that could be the student has a job or is in a state-approved work experience, or is in a job that's being supervised or with strong involvement by the school district. So maybe there's a position within the school, or there's an opportunity outside of school, like an internship or something like that, that the school is very involved in or has set up or is supervising or something like that. Even doing some kinds of volunteer work would qualify as long as the school is providing supervision. So it can't be like, hey, Mr. Jones, I had a great summer. I helped my uncle 3 days a week at his veterinary clinic. That's not going to qualify unless the school has, taken steps to supervise and document that experience. Pretty important thing here, this is a tip that advocates should know, is the school must ensure that there are special education supports and services available for these activities. So if a student needs transportation, or a student needs an aide or a job coach or special accommodations or special instruction to prepare them for this work-based experience, the school is required to provide them. So I think that's really important to know. And to be real honest with you, schools are really scrambling at the moment because all of this CDOS credential came out at the end of last year, and they were given virtually no time to make sure that they have these courses available, that they have these work experiences available, and schools are scrambling to put these things together. And while I feel bad for the schools in that regard, as an advocate for students with disabilities, they are supposed to be provided, and I'm going to be advocating and making sure that they're provided. So that's the third requirement. Fourth requirement, because I know we're kind of getting low on time now, fourth requirement is to develop an employability profile. And what this is it's basically a resume. It's a document that shows the experiences that the student has had, what commencement level CDOS standards they've achieved, any technical skills and other kinds of skills or assessments that have been administered to the student. Basically something that shows it's a resume with some specific requirements, and that profile has to be completed within a year prior to the students graduating. Well, they're not graduating with a diploma, they're leaving school. Now, here's another bit of an issue. Because this was rolled out at the end of last year, and this school year is the first year where the CDOS is going to be available, the state ed has said, you know what, we're going to give the principals of each public school some discretion in awarding this credential, because a student maybe doesn't have 218 hours of instruction, or they might not have 54 hours of work experience. But if you feel, principal, that this student does have good pre-employment skills, then you can go ahead and award this credential. And that is an issue, again, because if Principal A is liberally giving these out and Principal B is being very cautious and conservative in who they're being given to, then the employer out there is going to be getting completely mixed messages. And we may be, again, getting students who are not proficient, and then the employer's kind of in a bad spot, and that employer's not going to open their door the next time. So, I mean, it is a problematic issue, and I think something that needs to be addressed. And I think you all as advocates really need to know some of the pitfalls there, because nobody wants to see this credential become meaningless like the IEP diploma became meaningless. At the same time, we want students to be able, to have a credential. So it's kind of a conundrum. Just keep in mind, public schools have specific obligations in awarding the CDOSC. First of all, schools cannot say, oh, you're getting a CDOSC, so we're putting you on that track. We're not going to worry about the regents anymore. Public schools must be doing everything they can to make sure students are still on track to get a local or regents diploma, and providing the support that whatever they need to be able to do that. So they have to have meaningful access to the general education curriculum, and there has to be a connection between the CDOSC and the transition in the IEP. And hopefully the brief overview of transition that I gave you with regard to the IEP, you can see how consistent that is with CDOSC. So we should always be talking about what is the student's goals, career-related goals, what are their needs, and how are we going to get them there? What skills do they need to develop? So that would shape what courses they might take, what work-based learning experiences they might have. But the IEP guarantees that the student is going to have the supports they need to participate in those courses or participate in those work-based experiences, because those kinds of supports would be special education supports. So definitely a place to advocate, and if the school is not implementing an IEP or is refusing to add services to an IEP, then there are certainly procedural safeguards that the parents have and the student has to challenge those decisions by the school. So just wrapping up here, when looking at some strategies with regard to these standards, it's really important to understand what the requirements of the diplomas and the credentials are, and what the limitations of the credentials are. Making sure that everybody's on the same page, working with your school staff and administrators to make sure that their students going to have the instruction and opportunities and supports to be able to follow through with those, to achieve these credentials. You always want to be following up things in writing, keeping things in writing when you're communicating with the school district. You want to make sure that the IEP provides the supports that the student needs, and you want to make sure that the IEP is detailing the student's needs, any areas of weakness, because if it's documenting an area of weakness, then there's an obligation on the part of the school district to address those needs. All right, so that's wrapping up my session, and I'm going to let Bridget do her session, and then if anybody has any questions, I'll be here.
All right, thank you, Julie. You shared lots of really great information with us today. I just want to share a little bit of information about us and our upcoming events before I moved on to the final portion of the question and answer. So we are the Brain Injury Association of New York State. We're the statewide nonprofit membership organization that advocates on behalf of individuals with brain injuries and their families. Can you just advance to the next slide, Julie?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. And this is just a bunch of our contact information if you'd like to get in touch with us or visit our website. And we have lots of great free resources ranging from our monthly webinars regarding children and veterans to pamphlets and DVDs. We're also doing a lot with concussion management in schools, so if you'd like to get copies of these resources, please contact us. We do have them available electronically on our website as well. And these are just a few more of our resources that we worked on with the CDC regarding sports concussions, and we also have these available electronically and in hard copies if anyone is interested. And the next thing I wanted to let everyone know about is regarding our upcoming professional symposium, latest developments in brain injury identification, rehabilitation, and treatment, taking place at the Albany Marriott on June 5th from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. If you're interested in attending, please visit our website for more information and registration details. And we will be hosting our 32nd annual conference on June 5th to June 6th in Albany, once again taking place at the Albany Marriott. So please visit our website for more information on that. We would love to see you there. And finally, be sure to check us out on Facebook and Twitter for news and updates about the associations. They're both really great tools to stay informed. We update them pretty daily, so definitely check that out. All right, let's see if we have any questions in. Just a reminder for everyone, the resources mentioned by Julie are uploaded onto our website as well as the PowerPoint. So if anyone is looking for any of those, just refer to the website, and if there's something you don't see on there, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to get that to Julie for you. We have one question regarding IEPs and college students. Do you have any recommendations for IEPs and college students?
There is no IEP for college students. So IEPs are governed under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a federal law, and it applies to students goes from preschool through age 21. After age 21, there's no more IEP, no more IDEA. However, students in college are still entitled to 504 accommodations. So student maybe had a 504 plan in school, high school, or maybe they had an IEP that had 504 accommodations on it. I mean, most IEPs do have accommodations, testing accommodations, maybe classroom accommodations, things like that. And those types of accommodations will be available in colleges. Every college has an office that is there to assist students with disabilities in securing accommodations. But it's very different than the high school level or the grade school level. Public schools are required to seek out kids and develop IEPs. In college, the burden is on the student. So if the student feels that they need accommodations, they have to knock on the door of this office. They have to provide information showing that they have a disability and they need accommodations, and they need to notify the professors that they are entitled to accommodations that are approved by the college. So it's much more, the student has to be a lot more proactive. There's nobody out there obligated to address the needs of the student unless the student is initiating that process.
Thank you, Julie. And does anyone have any more questions? Before we wrap it up, I'll give everyone a few seconds just in case something comes up. Anyone? Okay. So I guess that'll conclude our webinar presentation. I want to thank Julie for her fantastic presentation, and I hope that you all found it as informative and educational as I did. Once again, if you have any questions that weren't answered or if you think of something later, please send them to me. I know Julie would be delighted to answer them for you. And of course, I want to thank all of you for participating. Please continue to spread the word about our monthly webinars. And again, we have lots of wonderful resources, so please don't hesitate to ask about them. Be sure to visit our website for more information about upcoming events and webinars, and to view today's recording of the presentation or to download the slides or any of the resources mentioned. The recording should be up by next week, so just be on the lookout for that. Thank you, everyone, again, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Bye.